By April of 1242, Prince Alexander Yaroslavich of Novgorod had already made the calculation that would define his legacy. He would submit to the Mongols in the east to preserve the resources necessary to destroy the crusaders advancing from the west. The choice was not born of cowardice, but of cold arithmetic. Batuken's armies, which had burned Kiev to ash in 1240 and reduced the principalities of Rus to tribute-paying vassals, commanded a military force that could not be defeated. The Teutonic Order, a brotherhood of German warrior monks who had spent 2 decades transforming the Baltic coast into a militarized theocracy, commanded a force that could be. Novgorod, the wealthiest city in Rus, a quasi-republican trading powerhouse that exported fortunes in furs and amber to the Hanseatic League, was paradoxically the most vulnerable. Its fertile hinterlands lay hundreds of miles to the south. Its grain supplies traveled through territories now controlled by rivals. Its western frontier, the source of its wealth, was under direct assault. The Crusaders had already taken Novgorod's sister city and built a fortress at Kapori, a day's march from the capital. The Mongols had made their demands clear. Pay tribute, send your princes to kneel at Sarai, and you may keep your church, your city, and your lives. Alexander accepted. The Germans would not be granted the same terms. The clash on Lake Peipus was not inevitable. It was the product of a specific and volatile convergence. A commercial republic with more wealth than swords, an empire from the steppes that measured power in subjugated cities and tribute wagons, and a crusading order that had discovered converting pagans at sword point was more profitable than dying for Jerusalem. Novgorod was a city that had, by the standards of medieval Rus, made a dangerous wager on a radical idea. That power could be hired, fired, and controlled by an assembly of merchants and landowners rather than inherited by divine right. In 1136, the city had ejected its prince and declared itself a republic. Supreme authority rested, at least in theory, with the Vesh, a popular assembly of free male citizens who gathered at the sound of a bell to debate policy, declare war, and elect or dismiss their prince. The Prince of Novgorod was not a sovereign. He was a contractor, a military specialist brought in to command the army and defend the city's sprawling northern territories, but forbidden from owning land within the city limits, prohibited from interfering in internal governance, and always subject to termination. Real power belonged to the boyar oligarchy, the families who monopolized the elected offices of Posadnik and Tysiatsky, and who controlled the selection of the archbishop. This political structure was the direct consequence of Novgorod's economic position. The city sat at the terminus of the Volkhov River, a natural highway connecting the interior of Rus to the Baltic Sea and through it to the markets of Western Europe. As the easternmost trading post of the Hanseatic League, Novgorod channeled vast quantities of furs, sable, ermine, fox alongside amber, wax, and honey westward in exchange for Flemish textiles, German metalwork, and Scandinavian herring. This trade created a merchant class wealthy enough to resist princely autocracy and sophisticated enough to maintain a network of commercial treaties and diplomatic correspondence. Archaeological evidence has uncovered over 1,000 birch bark letters, ephemeral notes written by artisans, women, and common citizens, suggesting a degree of functional literacy unmatched in medieval Europe outside of Italy. The city could afford monumental stone churches, paved streets, and a standing professional militia. But wealth created dependency. Novgorod's hinterland, a vast expanse of northern forests stretching to the White Sea, produced furs and fish, not grain. The city's population, which may have reached 30,000 by the 13th century, consumed far more bread than its agricultural territories could supply. The deficit was made up by imports from the southern principalities, particularly Vladimir Suzdal, which controlled the fertile lands of the Oka and Klyazma river valleys. A grain embargo imposed by a hostile Grand Prince of Vladimir could starve Novgorod into submission without a single sword being drawn. The republic's independence was never absolute. It was negotiated year by year through trade concessions, strategic marriages, and the periodic hiring of princes from the very dynasties it sought to keep at arm's length. In 1236, when the Boyars invited the 15-year-old Alexander Yaroslavich to serve as their military commander, they were making a calculated investment in a young man whose family connections might secure the grain supply and whose inexperience might make him easier to control. They would be proven wrong on the latter count. The Mongol invasion was not a single catastrophic event. It was a systematic campaign of annihilation spread across 5 years, executed with a speed, discipline, and ruthlessness that shattered the political geography of Rus. The first warning came in 1223, when a Mongol reconnaissance force encountered a coalition of Russian princes and their Cuman allies at the Kalka River. The Mongols destroyed the alliance in a single afternoon, killing 6 princes and thousands of their retainers, then vanished back into the steppe. For 13 years, Rus heard nothing. Then, in the winter of 1237, Beta Khan returned with an army estimated at 30,000 to 40,000 men, a force larger, better organized, and more technologically advanced than anything the fragmented Russian principalities could field. The invasion began in December 1237 with the siege of Ryazan. When the city refused to surrender, the Mongols erected siege engines, breached the walls, and methodically slaughtered the population. The prince, his family, and his retinue were killed. The city burned, the surrounding countryside depopulated. In February 1238, the Mongols took Vladimir, the political capital of northeastern Rus, after a 4-day siege. The Grand Prince's family, seeking refuge in a cathedral, were burned alive when the Mongols set the building on fire. 14 cities fell in a single month. By March, the Mongols had advanced to within 100 kilometers of Novgorod before turning south, a decision attributed by later chroniclers to the onset of the spring thaw, which would have turned the forested approaches into impassable marshland. Novgorod was spared not by resistance, but by geography. The reprieve was temporary. In 1239 and 1240, the Mongols returned to complete the subjugation of southern Rus. Kiev, the ancient heart of the Kievan state and the ecclesiastical seat of the Orthodox Church, was besieged in November 1240. When the walls were breached, the Mongols sacked the city with such thoroughness that a visitor 6 years later reported finding only ruins and scattered bones. Modern estimates suggest that the population of Rus declined by as much as 1/3 between 1237 and 1242, the result of mass killings, enslavement, famine, and disease. The political structure of Kievan Rus collapsed entirely. In its place emerged a new reality. The princes of Rus were now vassals of the Golden Horde, the Western Mongol Khanate based at Sarai on the lower Volga. Each prince was required to travel to the Horde to receive a yarlik, a patent of authority from the Khan. A Mongol census was imposed to systematize the collection of tribute. Novgorod, though never physically occupied, submitted. The city agreed to pay tribute and acknowledged the Khan's overlordship, a pragmatic decision championed by Alexander's father, Grand Prince Yaroslav. The calculation was coldly rational. The Mongols could not be defeated, but they could be appeased, and appeasement bought autonomy. The Mongols proved remarkably flexible overlords. They exempted the Orthodox Church from taxation, did not interfere in internal governance, and showed little interest in religious conversion. What they demanded was obedience and silver. This arrangement, however humiliating, allowed Novgorod to preserve its commercial network, its republican institutions, and its Orthodox faith. It also freed the city's resources to confront a different enemy advancing from the opposite direction. The Teutonic Order had learned in the deserts of Palestine that holy war, however spiritually satisfying, was a poor investment if it bankrupted the investor. By the early 13th century, the Crusader states in the Levant were collapsing. The Order's leadership recognized that the future lay not in defending Jerusalem, but in conquering new territories in Europe, where land, labor, and tribute could be extracted under the banner of Christianization. The opportunity came in 1226 when Conrad of Masovia, a Polish duke struggling to subdue the pagan Prussians on his northern border, invited the order to assist in exchange for any territory they could conquer. The Teutonic Knights accepted, obtained a papal charter granting them sovereignty over their conquests, and embarked on a 50-year campaign that would transform the southeastern Baltic coast into a militarized theocracy. The conquest of Prussia was methodical. The order deployed a military system honed in the Levant, heavily armored knights supported by crossbowmen, engineers, and a logistics network capable of sustaining multi-year campaigns. They built castles at strategic intervals, each serving as a base for further expansion and a symbol of permanent occupation. Pagan resistance was met with annihilation. Entire tribes were either exterminated or forcibly baptized, their lands seized, and redistributed to German colonists who were incentivized to settle with grants of land and tax exemptions. By the mid-13th century, the order controlled a sovereign state stretching from the Vistula to the Niemen, a domain that monopolized the lucrative Baltic amber and grain trades. In 1237, the order expanded by absorbing the remnants of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, a smaller military order that had been attempting to conquer modern-day Latvia and Estonia. The Livonian Brothers had suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Saul in 1236, losing their master and a third of their knights to a Lithuanian ambush. The merger, sanctioned by the Pope, placed the Teutonic Order in control of Livonia, a patchwork of conquered Estonian and Latvian territories, recently Christianized and seething with resentment. This brought the order directly onto Novgorod's western frontier. The ideology driving this expansion was a synthesis of religious conviction, institutional ambition, and territorial imperialism. The order's members were monks bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but their poverty was collective. The institution itself accumulated vast wealth. Papal bulls granted them the same spiritual rewards offered to crusaders bound for Jerusalem. By 1240, with the pagan Baltic tribes largely subdued, the order's attention turned eastward to the Orthodox principalities of Pskov and Novgorod. These were not pagans. They were Christians, albeit of the wrong denomination. The schism between Rome and Constantinople, formalized in 1054, and bloodied by the Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204, provided the theological justification. In the eyes of the papacy and the order, the Orthodox were schismatics, and their lands were legitimate targets for holy war. The Mongol invasions, which had devastated Rus, presented an opportunity too lucrative to ignore. Alexander was 21 years old in 1242, but he had already lived through more political upheaval, military crisis, and strategic compromise than most men experience in a lifetime. Born around 1221 into the Rurikid dynasty, Alexander's childhood was dominated by his father's ruthless political maneuvering. Yaroslav Selenich was a survivor in a world where princely succession was determined less by primogeniture than by violence, treachery, and the ability to command loyalty through fear and patronage. In 1236, Yaroslav secured his 15-year-old son an appointment as Prince of Novgorod, a position that was less an inheritance than a probationary contract. The boyars of Novgorod had no interest in a strong prince. They wanted a competent general who would defend their trade routes, suppress banditry, and return to his quarters when the fighting was over. Alexander, young and untested, seemed ideal. He proved far more capable than they anticipated. When the Mongols arrived in 1237, Alexander was 16, ruling a city geographically isolated from the carnage unfolding to the south and east. Novgorod heard reports of Vladimir's fall, of the Grand Prince's family burned alive in a cathedral, and of entire cities reduced to ash. But the Mongol army never arrived at its gates. The forests and marshes that surrounded Novgorod formed a natural barrier that even the Mongols chose not to breach. This accident of geography shaped Alexander's worldview. He understood with a clarity that many of his contemporaries refused to accept that the Mongol Empire was not an enemy that could be defeated through courage, faith, or tactical brilliance. It was a power so overwhelming that resistance meant annihilation. His father reached the same conclusion and submitted. Alexander would inherit this policy and refine it. But submission to the Mongols did not mean submission to everyone. In July 1240, a Swedish army led by Birger Jarl, and likely encouraged by papal agents seeking to extend Catholic influence eastward, landed at the confluence of the Neva River and the Azov. The Swedes, expecting little resistance from a city preoccupied with the Mongol threat, were overconfident. Alexander, with a small force of his personal retinue and Novgorodian militia, launched a surprise attack. The Battle of the Neva was brief and decisive. The Swedish commander was wounded, his camp thrown into chaos, and by morning the survivors were retreating to their ships. Alexander returned to Novgorod with a new title, Nevsky of the Neva, and a reputation as a commander who struck quickly and without hesitation. The boyars, however, found his growing authority unsettling. Novgorod's political culture was built on distrust of concentrated power, and a prince who won battles too decisively was a prince who might start ignoring the Vetch. Within months, a dispute erupted, and Alexander was dismissed. He withdrew to Pereslav-Zaleski, leaving Novgorod without a military commander. It was a short-sighted decision that the boyars would come to regret. By the autumn of 1241, the Livonian Order and its allies had occupied Pskov and constructed a fortress at Kopori, less than 100 kilometers from Novgorod. Raids into Novgorodian territory intensified. Merchants were ambushed. Villages were burned. The boyars, facing an existential threat and lacking a competent general, swallowed their pride and sent envoys to ask Alexander to return. He did, but not as a supplicant. His terms are not recorded, but his actions upon returning suggest he negotiated a freer hand in military matters and access to reinforcements from his father's territories. He would need both. Alexander's first move was characteristically direct. He marched on Kopori in the winter of 1241, stormed the fortress, and executed the local collaborators who had aided the Germans in its construction. By the spring of 1242, reinforced by his younger brother Andrei and a contingent of Vladimir Suzdal cavalry, Alexander advanced on Pskov, expelled the Livonian garrison, and liberated the city. He did not stop at the border, understanding that a defensive victory would only invite future invasions. Alexander pushed westward into the bishopric of Dorpat, raiding deep into enemy territory. His goal was to provoke a decisive engagement, forcing the Livonian Order to commit its main army to a battle where terrain, timing, and tactics would favor Novgorod. When a forward detachment of his army was defeated by the Knights, Alexander deliberately withdrew, pulling the crusaders eastward onto ground he had already chosen, the frozen surface of Lake Peipus. The army that advanced across Lake Peipus on the morning of April 5, 1242, was a professional military force, disciplined, well-equipped, and accustomed to victory. At its core were the brother knights of the Teutonic Order, men who had taken monastic vows and dedicated their lives to a single mission, the expansion of Christendom through conquest. They were not mercenaries motivated solely by plunder, though plunder was welcome. They were not feudal lords defending inherited lands, though the order accumulated vast estates. They were ideologues, true believers in a cause that fused religious salvation with imperial ambition. The Teutonic Order had been founded in 1190 during the siege of Acre as a hospital fraternity. Within a decade, under the leadership of Grandmaster Hermann von Salza, it had transformed into a militarized monastic order modeled on the Templars and Hospitallers. Its members were drawn primarily from the German nobility, younger sons with no inheritance prospects, who found in the order a path to land, status, and salvation. They wore white mantles emblazoned with a black cross, lived in communal fortresses under a strict hierarchical structure, and trained obsessively in siege warfare and heavy cavalry tactics. By the 1230s, the order had abandoned the collapsing crusader states of the Levant and relocated its headquarters to the Baltic. The conquest of Prussia demonstrated the order's institutional sophistication. Unlike traditional feudal armies that dissolved after a campaign season, the Teutonic Knights maintained a permanent military presence. They built a network of over 90 castles, each garrisoned year-round. They recruited engineers capable of constructing trebuchets, siege towers, and prefabricated pontoon bridges. They established a taxation system that extracted grain, timber, and labor from conquered populations, using the revenue to fund further expansion. The army that invaded Novgorodian territory reflected this hybrid structure. It was led by Bishop Hermann of Dorpat, a German prelate who commanded his own military retinue. The corps consisted of the brother knights of the Teutonic Order, perhaps several dozen heavily armored cavalry, supported by a larger contingent of half-brothers men who had taken lesser vows and served as sergeants. These were supplemented by Danish knights from northern Estonia, seasonal crusaders from Germany, and a sizable levy of Estonian infantry, recently conquered subjects who fought not out of conviction, but because they had no choice. This coalition was confident. The Teutonic Knights had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of crushing less disciplined opponents through coordinated heavy cavalry shock. Their tactical doctrine was simple and effective. Form the knights into a deep wedge-shaped column. Advance at a steady pace to preserve formation, then accelerate into a full charge at the final moment, driving the tip of the wedge into the enemy's center to shatter cohesion. This tactic, known in the Russian chronicles as the Zveno the Pig, had won battles across Prussia and Livonia. Medieval combat was not romantic. It was industrial violence, a collision of metal, flesh, and bone governed as much by physics as by courage. The battle on Lake Peipus would be decided by the weight of armor, the penetrating power of weapons, the cohesion of formations, and the stamina of men fighting in sub-zero temperatures on uncertain ground. The Teutonic Knight in 1242 was functionally a missile system built around a man and a horse. A fully equipped brother knight wore a knee-length hauberk of riveted mailless shirt composed of tens of thousands of interlocking iron rings. This garment alone weighed between 15 and 20 kilograms and provided effective protection against slashing cuts and most arrow strikes at range. Over the hauberk, many knights wore a coat of plates or early breastplate. The head was encased in a great helm, a cylindrical bucket of metal with narrow slits that offered near-total protection at the cost of severely restricted vision. Total weight, 30 to 35 kilograms of steel, distributed across the body, requiring constant muscular engagement to move and fight. The warhorse was armored as well. The destrier, a heavy cavalry mount bred specifically for war, stood taller and heavier than modern riding horses, capable of carrying a fully armored knight at a gallop. Together, knight and horse represented an investment equivalent to the annual income of a prosperous village. The knight's primary weapon was the lance, a 3 to 4 meters wooden shaft tipped with a narrow steel point, designed to be couched under the arm and driven forward by the horse's momentum. At full gallop, a lance strike could penetrate mail and drive through a man's torso. After the initial impact, when lances shattered or became embedded in bodies, the knight transitioned to the sword, a double-edged blade designed for cutting through mail or crushing bone through blunt force. The Novgorodian and Vladimir Suzdal forces that faced the Teutonic Knights were not peasants with pitchforks. They were professional soldiers, members of a military tradition that had been fighting steppe nomads, Scandinavian raiders, and rival principalities for centuries. The core of Alexander's army was the Druzhina, the prince's personal retinue, mounted warriors who served in exchange for land grants and patronage. These men were well equipped. A veteran Druzhina warrior might wear a lamellar cuirass, a torso defense made of small overlapping plates of hardened leather or steel laced together. Some wore mail hauberks. Helmets were typically conical, often with a nasal guard or face mask lighter, and less restrictive than the great helms of the Teutonic Knights. Weapons reflected a different combat philosophy. The primary weapon was the spear, versatile and effective in formation fighting and individual combat. Many warriors carried composite bows, the weapon of the steppe nomads that the Russians had adopted over centuries. The Novgorodian militia formed the infantry backbone. These were not professional soldiers, but they were not untrained either. Novgorod's political culture required military service as a condition of citizenship. The militia fought in dense formations, shield walls designed to absorb cavalry charges and hold ground. The critical advantage of the Russian system was adaptability. The Druzhina could fight as heavy cavalry or as horse archers, and dismount to fight on foot when terrain demanded it. The Teutonic Knights, by contrast, had spent 2 decades fighting enemies who either lacked heavy cavalry entirely or deployed it in insufficient numbers. They had developed a single overwhelmingly successful method that had calcified into doctrine. Alexander did not stumble into the Battle of Lake Peipus. He engineered it step by deliberate step, with the precision of a man who understood that defensive wars fought on an enemy's timetable ended in slow strangulation. By the winter of 1242, Pskov had been under Livonian occupation for nearly 2 years. Its population was subjected to the extractive governance of a German garrison. Its strategic position was exploited to raid Novgorodian territory with impunity. The fortress at Kopori, hastily erected by the Livonians with the assistance of local collaborators, sat within striking distance of Novgorod's vital trade routes, a dagger aimed at the Republic's economic throat.
The boyars, having dismissed Alexander in a fit of political short-sightedness, now faced the consequences. Their sister city occupied their frontier collapsing, and their hired prince sitting comfortably in Pereslav-Zaleski, waiting for them to admit they had made a mistake. When the envoys arrived asking him to return, Alexander extracted concessions, likely a freer hand in military decisions and access to reinforcements from his father, Vladimir Suzdal territories, before agreeing. He returned not as a supplicant, but as the only man capable of salvaging a deteriorating situation. He returned with a plan that had nothing to do with defense. His first target was Kopori. In the winter of 1241, with the ground frozen hard enough to support cavalry and rivers transformed into highways of ice, Alexander marched on the fortress with a force drawn from both Novgorod's militia and his personal Druzhina. The assault was swift. The fortress, lightly garrisoned and built hastily, fell after a brief siege. Alexander's treatment of the survivors revealed the calculus that would define his approach to the coming campaign. The German and Estonian garrison troops were taken prisoner, likely for ransom or exchange, a pragmatic decision, acknowledging their value as commodities. The local collaborators, Russians who had assisted in the fortress's construction and provisioning, were executed. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a message delivered with calculated brutality. Collaboration would be punished not with imprisonment, but with death. A deterrent aimed at the population of the borderlands, where loyalty was fluid and survival often required accommodation with whichever army arrived first. The execution of traitors also served a domestic political function, demonstrating to the Novgorodian boyars and citizenry that Alexander was willing to act decisively when the Republic's interests were threatened. It was a performance of authority, one that would be difficult to challenge. By early 1242, reinforced by his younger brother Andrei and a contingent of heavy cavalry from Vladimir Suzdal, Alexander advanced further. The city's liberation was less a battle than a restoration. The German garrison, isolated and outnumbered, offered minimal resistance. Chronicles record that the Livonian voivode and his knights were captured and sent in chains to Novgorod, paraded through the streets as trophies before being imprisoned. Pskov's liberation was strategically critical. It secured Novgorod's southern flank and denied the Livonian order a forward base for further expansion. but it was insufficient. Alexander understood that driving the enemy out of occupied territory would only reset the board, inviting another incursion whenever the Livonians rebuilt their strength. A defensive victory would be celebrated, chronicled, and ultimately meaningless. So Alexander did something unexpected, violating every convention of prudent medieval warfare. He invaded in March 1242. With Pskov secured and his army consolidated, Alexander crossed the border into the bishopric of Dorpat, pushing deep into enemy territory. His forces raided the surrounding countryside, burned villages, seized livestock, and inflicted the routine devastation medieval armies used to deny resources to the enemy. This was economic warfare aimed at disrupting the agricultural base that sustained the Livonian garrisons and demonstrating to the local Estonian population that their new Christian overlords could not protect them.
But the raids served a secondary, more dangerous purpose. They were beta deliberate provocation designed to force the Livonian order to respond with its full strength. Alexander deployed a forward detachment, a smaller force under the command of his brother and key lieutenants, to push even deeper into Dorpat territory. On or around April 1st, this detachment encountered a Livonian force, was defeated, suffered casualties, and retreated eastward in disarray. The chronicles do not specify the size of the engagement or the composition of the forces involved, but the outcome was clear. The Livonians had won a skirmish and were now pursuing what they believed to be a retreating, demoralized enemy. This was precisely what Alexander intended. The Livonians, emboldened by the victory and eager to exploit their momentum, mobilized their main army and pursued Alexander's forces eastward, crossing the frozen expanse of Lake Peipus in search of a decisive engagement. From their perspective, this was rational. They had spent 2 years consolidating their hold on Pskov and surrounding territories, and Alexander's raids threatened to unravel those gains. Allowing him to ravage Dorpat with impunity would embolden further resistance and signal weakness to the Estonian subjects who had been forcibly Christianized and resented their conquerors. The Livonians had just demonstrated tactical superiority in the recent skirmish. Their cavalry had proven capable of routing Russian forces in open combat, and their confidence in the wedge formation was absolute. From their perspective, this was an opportunity to crush Novgorod's army in the field, eliminate Alexander as a threat, and re-establish dominance over the entire northwestern frontier. What they did not consider, or dismissed if they did, was the terrain. Lake Peipus, a vast body of water separating Livonia from the Novgorodian borderlands, was frozen solid in early April. But April ice is not February ice. The surface, which had borne the weight of trade caravans and foot traffic throughout the winter, was beginning to soften as temperatures rose. The ice was still thick enough to support men and horses, but it was no longer uniform. Patches of weakness, invisible from above, formed where springs fed warmer water into the lake, or where the ice had refrozen after earlier thaws. The surface was slick, offering poor footing for horses unaccustomed to such conditions. The frozen surface of Lake Peipus in early April was not solid ground. It was not a stable platform. It was a membrane stretched across several meters of black water, a temporary suspension of the natural order that would collapse back into liquid within weeks. Thickness varied 40 centimeters in some places, half that in others, and the consistency was inconsistent. Where the ice had formed early in the winter and built up in successive layers, it could support enormous weight. Where springs or currents fed warmer water into the lake, the ice remained thin, treacherous, and invisible from above. By April 5th, the temperature was rising. Daytime thaws softened the surface, creating a layer of slush and standing water that refroze into uneven ridges at night. The footing was poor. Horses, their hooves designed for earth and grass, slipped and stumbled on the slick surface. Men in armor, their center of gravity already high and unstable, found that a single misstep could send them sprawling, and getting up while wearing 30 kilograms of steel was a slow. exhausting process that left them vulnerable to spear thrusts and axe blows from standing opponents. Alexander had chosen this battlefield deliberately, and the choice revealed a strategic sophistication that distinguished him from the majority of his contemporaries. He had withdrawn eastward from his raids into Dorpat, pulling the Livonian army deeper into disputed territory, and positioned his forces on the eastern edge of the lake, near a landmark the Novgorodian chronicles call the Raven Siroc, or Crow's Stone. The precise location has been debated by historians for centuries. No definitive physical feature matching the description has been identified on the modern shoreline, and the lake's water levels have shifted over the intervening 800 years. What matters is the strategic logic. Alexander positioned his army with the shoreline at their backs, a deployment that conventional military wisdom would have condemned as suicidal. An army with no room to retreat is an army that will be annihilated if it breaks. But Alexander was not planning to retreat. He was planning to force the Livonians to charge across open ice over uncertain footing toward a static target, while his own cavalry concealed on the flanks near the more stable ground of the shoreline waited to encircle them once they committed. The battlefield was bordered to the north and south by forested shoreline, dense stands of birch and pine that extended down to the ice, and provided cover for troops positioned out of sight. The lake's surface at this point was wide enough to accommodate large formations, but narrow enough that flanking movements could cover the distance quickly. Once launched, the Livonians advancing from the west would see the Russian infantry drawn up in a defensive line, shields locked, spears bristling, apparently unsupported by cavalry. The natural instinct, the tactical doctrine hammered into every Teutonic Knight through decades of campaigns, would be to form the wedge, charge the center, and break it. The ice would seem like an advantage, a flat surface that allowed for clear sight lines and unobstructed movement. What the Livonians would not see, could not see until it was too late, was the Dina cavalry concealed near the shoreline, motionless, waiting. The weather on April 5th is not recorded in the chronicles, but the season dictates the conditions. Early April in northwestern Russia is a transitional period, neither full winter nor spring. Temperatures hover just above freezing during the day, dropping below at night. The sky would have been overcast, typical for the region, with the flat, diffuse light that eliminates shadows and makes distance difficult to judge. Wind, if present, would have been biting, making fingers stiff and unresponsive, a significant problem for men trying to grip weapons and maintain control of horses. The Novgorodian militia, drawn up in the center, would have understood what was coming. Many of them had fought before, against Swedish raiders, against rival principalities, against bandit war bands, but few had faced the Teutonic wedge, a concentrated fury of armored cavalry striking at full speed. They would have seen the Livonian army assembling in the distance, watched as the knights formed their characteristic formation. They would have seen the lances lowered, the shields raised, the formation beginning to move. Medieval infantry facing a cavalry charge had two options: hold the line or break and die. There was no third choice. If they held, if they absorbed the impact, if they kept their shields locked and their spears braced, if they dragged the knights from their horses, they might survive. If they broke, if panic spread and men turned to run, they would be ridden down from behind and butchered in the rout. The militia's discipline would determine the outcome far more than the cavalry waiting on the flanks. Alexander had placed the burden of survival on the least experienced, least armored, and most expendable components of his army, because he had no other option. The Livonian knights advancing across the ice were confident. They had reason to be. The wedge had worked in Prussia, in Livonia, in Estonia, against every enemy they had encountered for 2 decades. The Russians ahead of them were stationary, defensive, apparently leaderless, formed into a dense block that invited the very tactic the knights had perfected. There were no visible cavalry reserves, no apparent flanking forces. They advanced at a trot, conserving the horses' energy for the final acceleration. the wedge holding its shape, the tip aimed like a spear point at the center of the Russian line. They were 200 meters away when the first Russian arrows began to fall. Then 100 meters, then the final acceleration, the shift from trot to canter to gallop, the thunder of hooves on ice, the lances leveled, the distance closing in seconds. The Russian line did not move. It did not break. It simply waited, shields raised. Spears angled forward. Men braced behind men. The sound of the impact was not a single crash, but a cascading series of collisions. Wood splintering, metal shrieking, horses screaming, men shouting that rippled through both formations in the span of heartbeats. The tip of the Livonian wedge, perhaps a dozen knights at full gallop, struck the center of the Russian line with the kinetic energy of several tons traveling at speed. Shields shattered, spears snapped, or were driven backward into the men holding them. The front rank of the Novgorodian militia was obliterated. Men knocked down, trampled, impaled on lances that punched through shields and mail and torsos, before snapping off or pulling free. The wedge penetrated, driving into the Russian formation like a blade into flesh, widening the breach as successive ranks of knights followed, their horses pushing forward over the bodies of the fallen, 10, 15, 20 meters into the Russian center. But the line did not break. The second and third ranks of the militia braced and, forewarned, absorbed the shock. Men who had been pushed back or knocked down scrambled to their feet, grabbing for dropped weapons, reforming the wall. The militia fought not as individuals, but as a collective mass, shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, using their spears to jab at horses' legs, bellies, and faces. A warrior, wounded and panicked, rears its rider, unbalanced, fights to stay mounted. Another horse, its front leg broken by a spear thrust, collapses, throwing its knight forward onto the ice. The knight, encased in 30 kilograms of steel, hits the ground hard. The impact stuns him, and before he can rise, 2 militia men are on him. Axes rising and falling, targeting the joints in the armor, neck, armpit, groin, where mail can be penetrated. The wedge, designed to shatter formations and trigger panic, had instead become embedded. The momentum of the charge, once spent, could not be regenerated. The knights, packed tightly together in the narrow column, found themselves surrounded on 3 sides by Russian infantry who refused to flee. The tactical advantage of heavy cavalry mobility, shock, the ability to disengage and regroup vanished. The knights were now fighting a static mass on uncertain footing. Their horses slipped on the blood-slick ice, visibility restricted by helmets, movements constrained by the press of bodies. The lances, shattered or abandoned, were useless. The knights drew swords and maces, hacking at the infantry pressing in. But for every militia killed, another stepped forward. Then Alexander sprung the trap. The DJ cavalry, concealed on the flanks near the shoreline, erupted from cover and charged into the sides of the Livonian formation. The impact was not a frontal collision, but a lateral strike, hitting the knights at their most vulnerable points, the flanks of the wedge, where formation was thinnest and cohesion weakest. The Russian cavalry, moving at full speed across the short distance from the shore, drove into the Livonian rear, and sides with lances, spears, and swords, targeting the lighter-armed Estonian levies and half-brothers who formed the outer ranks. These troops, lacking the armor and training of the brother knights, broke almost immediately, scattering across the ice or collapsing under the Russian charge. The encirclement was not complete. There was no neat textbook pincer, but it was sufficient. The Livonians, who moments earlier had been prosecuting an offensive charge, were now surrounded on 3 sides, compressed into a shrinking pocket, fighting defensively against an enemy that outnumbered them and controlled the tempo. The battle devolved into a grinding, brutal melee. This was not the romanticized combat of chivalric legend. It was industrial slaughter. Men hacking and stabbing at close range. The wounded trampled underfoot. A Teutonic Knight, dismounted, fights on foot. his sword cutting down 1, 2, 3 Russian militia men before a Duga warrior on horseback drives a lance through his back. An Estonian levy, conscripted and terrified, drops his spear and runs. He makes it 10 meters before a Russian horseman rides him down. A Russian militia, his shield split and his left arm broken, uses his body weight to topple a knight from his horse, then dies as the knight's sword opens his throat. The Livonians fought with the desperation of men who understood they were losing. Bishop Hermann, commanding his retinue near the rear of the formation, attempted to organize a breakout, rallying the remaining knights for a coordinated push westward toward the shore they had crossed from. Some succeeded, cutting their way free through the Russian cavalry and fleeing across the ice. Others, trapped in the center of the collapsing pocket, were pulled from their horses, beaten down, and killed or captured. The brother knights of the Teutonic Order, bound by vows and pride, fought to the last. The chronicles record that 20 knights were killed in the battle, a catastrophic loss for an order that rarely fielded more than 100 fully professed members in the entire Baltic region. Another 50 or 60, including knights, half-brothers, and Danish allies, were captured. The Estonian and other auxiliary troops fled once the formation disintegrated. The Russian cavalry pursued them across the ice for kilometers, running down stragglers. It was during this pursuit that the most famous and most contested element of the battle allegedly occurred, the drowning of the knights. The Novgorodian Chronicle, composed within a few years of the battle, makes no mention of mass drowning. The Livonian rhymed chronicle similarly omits it. The story appears in later Russian chronicles, particularly those written in the 15th and 16th centuries, which claim that the ice broke under the weight of the fleeing knights, causing them to drown in their armor. This narrative was enthusiastically embraced by Soviet historians and immortalized in Sergei Eisenstein's 1938 film. The truth is more prosaic. The ice in early April, while softened and weakened, was almost certainly thick enough to support men and horses in most places. It is possible that isolated patches of thin ice gave way under retreating soldiers, causing a handful of drownings, incidents that were later exaggerated. What is certain is that the Livonian army was shattered. Of the force that had advanced across the lake that morning, perhaps half escaped. The rest were killed, captured, or drowned in small numbers. The battle on Lake Peipus was fought with swords and lances, but it was sold, justified, and remembered as a holy war. Both sides draped their strategic ambitions in theological language, wrapped territorial conquest in the rhetoric of salvation, and transformed political calculation into divine mandate. The collision of orthodoxy and Catholicism, complicated by the Great Schism of 1054 and poisoned by the Fourth Crusade, sack of Constantinople in 1204, gave the conflict a theological intensity that transcended ordinary dynastic warfare. The Teutonic Knights were not simply expanding their territory. They were, in their telling, rescuing souls from schism. Alexander Nevsky was not simply defending Novgorod's trade routes. He was, in his telling, protecting the true faith from Latin corruption. The Teutonic Order's claim to legitimacy rested on papal authorization. A series of bulls issued by successive popes granted the order the same spiritual privileges offered to crusaders bound for Jerusalem. These bulls declared that fighting in the Baltic, whether against pagan Prussians, Lithuanians, or Orthodox Russians, earned the same indulgences, the same remission of sins as liberating the Holy Sepulchre. This allowed the order to recruit knights, raise funds, and attract German settlers by promising not just land and plunder, but salvation itself. The extension of this crusading ideology to the Orthodox principalities required rhetorical adjustment, but not much. The Orthodox Church, headquartered in Constantinople, had split from Rome in 1054 over doctrinal disputes, the Filioque clause, papal supremacy, clerical celibacy that were obscure to most lay people, but absolute to theologians. From Rome's perspective, the Orthodox were schismatics, Christians who had broken communion with the true church. By the 1240s, the papacy under Innocent IV was actively promoting the idea that Orthodox territories could be targeted for conversion forcibly if necessary. Alexander Nevsky and the Orthodox hierarchy understood this threat with perfect clarity. The Mongol invasion, catastrophic as it had been, did not threaten the Orthodox faith. Bat Khan and the Golden Horde were pragmatic overlords with no interest in forced conversion. The Mongols exempted the Orthodox Church from taxation, allowed metropolitans and bishops to continue their functions, and protected church property from confiscation. Submitting to Mongol suzerainty meant paying tribute and acknowledging the Khan's political authority. But it did not mean renouncing orthodoxy, accepting foreign priests, or subordinating the church to an external hierarchy. The Teutonic Order offered no such accommodation. Wherever the order conquered, Catholic bishops followed, Orthodox churches were seized or demolished, and the local population was compelled to accept papal authority. Pskov, during its 2-year occupation, had experienced this firsthand. The Novgorodian Chronicle frames the battle on the ice in explicitly religious terms. The text describes the Livonian invasion as an assault not merely on territory, but on orthodoxy itself, and Alexander's victory as divine intervention on behalf of the faithful. The Chronicle claims that an army of angels, invisible to mortals, fought alongside the Russians. This was not dispassionate history. It was hagiography in formation, a construction of a narrative in which Alexander was an instrument of God's will. This religious framing had profound political consequences. Alexander's cooperation with the Mongols, which might have been condemned as collaboration, was instead interpreted as strategic wisdom that preserved the church and the soul of Rus. His victory over the Teutonic Knights was elevated into a civilizational defense. The Orthodox Church, recognizing the value of this narrative, canonized Alexander as a saint in 1547, more than 3 centuries after his death. The Church's message was unambiguous. Better the tolerant yoke of the Tatars than the spiritual annihilation promised by Rome. The battle on the ice is documented in 2 near-contemporary sources, both composed within decades of the event, both written by partisans with ideological commitments, and both frustratingly vague on the details that modern historians require. The Novgorodian Chronicle describes Alexander's campaign, the liberation of Pskov, the incursion into Dorpat, the battle on April 5th, and the outcome: 20 Livonian knights killed, 50 captured, and the enemy pursued across the ice for 7 versts, roughly 7 kilometers. The account is brief, devoid of tactical detail, and silent on troop numbers, formations, or the mechanics of the engagement. It does not mention drowning knights, collapsing ice, or divine intervention, though later copies of the Chronicle add these embellishments. The Livonian Rhind Chronicle, a verse chronicle composed around 1290 by an unknown author affiliated with the Teutonic Order, acknowledges the defeat, reports that 20 brother knights were killed, and 6 captured, notably lower than the Novgorodian figures and attributes, the loss to the Russians' numerical superiority. The Chronicle provides slightly more tactical detail than the Novgorodian version, mentioning that the Germans fought bravely and that many Estonians fell, but it offers no description of formations, terrain, or the sequence of the engagement. These are the only near-contemporary sources. Everything else, the elaborate battle descriptions, the drowning knights, the dramatic set pieces immortalized in art and film, derives from later chronicles composed centuries after the fact in political contexts that demanded heroic narratives and clear moral lessons. By the 15th century, Muscovite chronicles began to amplify the scale and significance of the battle, increasing the numbers of enemy dead, emphasizing Alexander's genius, and introducing the motif of divine intervention. The Life of Alexander Nevsky, a hagiographic biography composed in the late 13th century and revised repeatedly over the following centuries, portrays Alexander as a saintly warrior, a figure of almost supernatural competence. The Drowning of the Knights, The single most famous image associated with the battle appears in Russian chronicles from the 16th century, but is absent from earlier sources. The Nikon Chronicle, compiled in the 1520s, claims that the ice broke under the weight of the fleeing Germans. This detail, unsupported by the Novgorodian or Livonian accounts, may be embellishment, metaphor, or garbled memory of isolated incidents inflated into a mass event. Modern historians analyzing seasonal conditions and ice thickness generally conclude that while small-scale drownings were possible, a wholesale collapse of the ice beneath the army is implausible. The myth persists not because it is documented, but because it is symbolically satisfying. The arrogant invaders, weighed down by the very armor that symbolized their power, dragged into the depths by the land itself. It is poetic justice, visual drama, and nationalist mythology condensed into a single image. The scholarly challenge is to extract history from hagiography, to identify what can be reasonably inferred from fragmentary sources and what is later invention. The core facts are not in dispute. Alexander Nevsky defeated a Livonian army on the ice of Lake Peipus on April 5, 1242. The Teutonic Order suffered significant casualties, including killed and captured knights, and the defeat forced the order to negotiate a peace that returned occupied territories to Novgorod. What remains contested is the scale. The chronicle casualty figures suggest a relatively small engagement, possibly involving a few hundred knights and 1,000 or two infantry on each side. Soviet-era historians inflated the numbers dramatically, claiming tens of thousands of combatants to magnify the victory's importance. These claims are unsupported by the sources and logistically implausible, given the population density and agricultural capacity of the region. The silence of Western European sources is also telling. No chronicler in Germany, France, or the Papal Court mentions the battle, suggesting it was not perceived as a major event outside the immediate region. The Teutonic Order, while embarrassed by the defeat, was not crippled. It continued its expansion in Prussia and Livonia, negotiated peace with Novgorod within a year, and suffered no lasting strategic damage. Only in Russia, and only over time, did the battle grow into a foundational myth. The battle on the ice has been weaponized repeatedly, pressed into service by successive Russian states to legitimize territorial ambitions, demonize the West, and construct a narrative of eternal Russian resilience against foreign aggression. This process began in the 16th century, when Muscovite chroniclers amplified Alexander's victories to glorify the emerging Russian state and its orthodox identity. It intensified during the Russian Empire, when Alexander was canonized and depicted in art and literature as a warrior saint who defended Holy Rus against Catholic encroachment. It reached its peak during the Soviet period, when Stalin rehabilitated Alexander Nevsky, previously dismissed by early Bolsheviks as a feudal oppressor, as a symbol of Russian patriotism. The Soviet appropriation was ideologically incoherent, but politically effective. Alexander, a medieval prince who collaborated with the Mongols and fought to preserve a feudal republic, bore little resemblance to Soviet values, but he was Russian, victorious, and useful. Stalin commissioned Eisenstein's film, established the Order of Alexander Nevsky as a military decoration, and promoted the cult of Nevsky as part of a broader effort to channel Russian nationalism into support for the Soviet state. The battle on the ice was taught in schools as a foundational moment in Russian history. Sergei Eisenstein's 1938 film was not a historical film. It was a propaganda weapon, a cinematic exhortation disguised as a medieval epic. The battle on the ice, the film's climax, was staged as a confrontation between two civilizations. On one side, the Russian defenders were depicted as human, diverse, and righteous. On the other, the Teutonic Knights, rendered as faceless automatons in bucket helms and white cloaks, marched in mechanical precision, their faces hidden, their individuality erased. The knights were not characters. They were symbols of dehumanized Western aggression, a visual metaphor for the Nazi war machine that was, by 1938, obvious to everyone. When the ice finally breaks in the film, and the knights plunge into the water, dragged down by their armor, the scene functions as divine judgment, the land itself rejecting the invaders. The message was unambiguous. The West brings only death. Russia will always resist, and history favors the defenders. The film's influence on popular memory cannot be overstated. For generations of Soviet citizens, and later for millions of viewers worldwide, Eisenstein's Alexander Nevsky was the battle on the ice. The film's imagery replaced historical ambiguity with visual certainty. When historians pointed out that the drowning scene had no basis in the sources, the response from nationalist commentators was dismissive. The scene might not be literally true, but it was symbolically true, capturing the essential meaning of the battle, even if the details were invented. This is the logic of myth, where narrative coherence and emotional resonance matter more than factual accuracy. After the Soviet collapse, post-Soviet Russia continued to invoke Alexander Nevsky. The Church re-emphasized his sainthood. His icons reappeared in restored cathedrals, and his feast day was celebrated with renewed fervor. The state under Vladimir Putin embraced Alexander as a symbol of Russian resilience and Orthodox civilization under siege. In 2008, a state-sponsored television poll to determine the greatest Russian in history placed Alexander Nevsky first, ahead of Stalin, Pushkin, and Peter the Great. In speeches and public appearances, Putin has repeatedly invoked Alexander's legacy, framing contemporary conflicts with NATO, the European Union, and the United States as continuations of the struggle Alexander fought in 1242. The Alexander Nevsky myth has proven extraordinarily adaptable, surviving the transition from medieval Orthodox principality to Tsarist empire to atheist Soviet state to post-Soviet nationalist autocracy. Each iteration of the Russian state has found in Alexander what it needed: a warrior saint, a symbol of resistance, a justification for autocracy, a model of pragmatic collaboration with powerful neighbors, a champion of Orthodox purity. Alexander Yaroslavich died in 1263, age 42, on the road returning from the Mongol capital at Sarai, where he had traveled to negotiate with the Khan. The journey had become routine for him. He made multiple trips to the horde over the final decades of his life, performing the humiliating rituals of submission that ensured Novgorod's survival. He prostrated himself before Bat Khan, participated in shamanistic purification ceremonies that Orthodox priests would have condemned as pagan sacrilege, and distributed silver and gifts to secure favorable treatment for his principality. These were not the acts of a warrior saint. They were the acts of a politician who understood that survival required compromise, that pride was a luxury Rus could not afford, and that the true enemy was not the Mongols who tolerated orthodoxy, but the Teutonic Knights who sought to extinguish it. Alexander's contemporaries recognized this. He was respected as a capable general, feared as a ruthless enforcer, and resented by many of the Novgorodian boyars, whose autonomy he steadily eroded. He was not, during his lifetime, a legend. That transformation would require centuries. The collapse of Mongol power, the rise of Muscovy, and the relentless work of the Orthodox Church, which needed heroes and found in Alexander a man whose biography could be selectively edited into sanctity. The Orthodox Church canonized Alexander Nevsky in 1547, nearly 300 years after his death, during the reign of Ivan the Terrible. The timing was not coincidental. Even consolidating autocratic power and expanding Muscovite territory required historical precedents that legitimized strong princely authority, Orthodox purity, and resistance to the West. Alexander, reinterpreted through the lens of 16th century political needs, provided all three. The hagiographic life of Alexander Nevsky stripped away the moral ambiguities of his collaboration with the Mongols, and emphasized his victories over the Swedes and Germans. The text portrayed him not as a pragmatic politician, but as a holy warrior guided by divine favor, whose every decision served the glory of God and the defense of orthodoxy. The hagiography omitted his submission to the Mongols, his ruthless suppression of anti-Mongol uprisings in Novgorod, and his complicity in the exploitation of his own people to satisfy the horde's demands. The battle on the ice resolved one crisis and created another. The immediate crisis, the Livonian occupation of Pskov, the threat to Novgorod's trade routes, the very real possibility of German crusaders establishing permanent control over the northwestern frontier, was resolved decisively in Alexander's favor. The Livonian order withdrew, negotiated peace, and redirected its ambitions elsewhere. Novgorod's western border was secured, its commercial networks preserved, and its independence maintained. In the short term, Alexander emerged as the dominant military and political figure in northern Rus, a reputation that would carry him to the Grand Principality of Vladimir and allow him to navigate the treacherous politics of Mongol overlordship with a skill few of his contemporaries could match. But the victory on the ice created a second crisis, a crisis of interpretation that has persisted for 8 centuries. The battle, modest in scale and limited in immediate strategic consequence, was seized by successive Russian states and transformed into a foundational myth, a proof of Russian resilience, orthodox purity, and inevitable triumph over Western aggression. This myth, cultivated by the Church, weaponized by the Tsars, resurrected by Stalin, and embraced by Putin, has shaped Russian identity and Russian policy in ways that transcend the historical event. The battle on the ice became a template, a narrative structure imposed on every subsequent conflict with the West. From the Livonian Wars to the Napoleonic invasion to the Great Patriotic War to contemporary tensions with NATO, the myth insists that Russia is eternally under siege, that the West is eternally hostile, and that Russian survival depends on strong autocratic leadership willing to make brutal calculations and accept brutal compromises. The challenge for historians is to reclaim the event from the myth, to understand what actually happened in April 1242 and why it mattered without endorsing the nationalist propaganda that has encrusted the battle for centuries. The evidence suggests a significant regional engagement, tactically sophisticated, fought on uncertain terrain, resulting in a decisive, but not catastrophic defeat for the Teutonic Order and a strategic victory for Novgorod. Alexander demonstrated tactical competence, strategic patience, and a willingness to gamble on terrain and timing. The Livonians demonstrated tactical rigidity, overconfidence, and a failure to adapt their doctrine to unfamiliar conditions. The battle did not save Rus from annihilation. The Mongols had already determined Rus as fate, but it did secure Novgorod as autonomy and establish a border that would endure for decades. The drowning knights, the divine intervention, the tens of thousands of combatants, the civilizational stakes, these are later additions, inventions designed to elevate a medieval skirmish into a cosmic confrontation. They persist not because they are true, but because they are useful, because they provide emotional satisfaction, narrative coherence, and political justification. The historical Alexander, the man who calculated his odds, chose his enemies carefully, and died exhausted on a road from Sarai, has been entirely subsumed by the myth. And the myth, precisely because it is flexible, because it can be reshaped to fit any ideological framework, has become more powerful than any historical truth. The battle on the ice is no longer an event. It is a prophecy endlessly repeated, endlessly reinterpreted, endlessly invoked to explain why Russia must resist the West, why compromise is betrayal, and why victory, no matter how costly, is inevitable. Alexander Nevsky fought the battle on the ice because he calculated correctly that the Teutonic Knights could be defeated and the Mongols could not. He chose his enemies with ruthless pragmatism, prioritized survival over honor, and secured Novgorod's future by accepting Mongol overlordship while resisting Western encroachment. He was not a saint. He was a survivor. The myth that consumed him tells us more about the needs of later Russian states than about the man or the battle. The ice on Lake Peipus melted in the spring of 1242, as it always did, as it always does. The legend, frozen in place by centuries of retelling, has never thawed. And as long as Russia defines itself in opposition to the West, as long as the Kremlin invokes Alexander Nevsky to justify aggression, suppression, and autocracy, the battle on the ice will remain not a historical event, but a weapon, sharpened and wielded in conflicts that Alexander himself could never have imagined.